You already know the feeling. You walk into a room, a meeting, a party, a conversation that matters, and something happens before you open your mouth. Or doesn't happen. The room doesn't shift. Nobody looks up with that subtle recalibration that says this person just changed the air in here. You find a spot, you wait for your turn, and somewhere in the back of your mind runs a thought you'd never say out loud. Why does this keep happening to me? That thought is worth taking seriously. Not because it means something is broken in you, but because it's pointing at something real. Neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger ran a study at UCLA where participants were excluded from a simple computer game while lying inside an fMRI scanner. No confrontation, no insult, just being left out. What lit up in their brains was the anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that activates during physical pain. Being dismissed, overlooked, treated as invisible. It doesn't just sting metaphorically. It registers in the nervous system the way a burn does. The body doesn't distinguish between a broken bone and a broken belonging. Both are threats to survival. Both demand a response. So when you've spent years trying to earn respect, working harder, being more agreeable, building credentials, waiting patiently for people to notice, and still find yourself on the wrong side of that invisible line, the frustration you feel isn't weakness. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, sounding an alarm that something important is being lost. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most of what you've been taught about earning respect is wrong, not slightly off. Structurally wrong. Kindness doesn't generate authority. Credentials don't create presence. Waiting your turn doesn't build influence. It builds a habit of waiting. None of these things are bad, but they speak to a different conversation than the one your brain is actually having with every person you meet. That conversation starts in 150 milliseconds, before your first word, before your handshake. In less time than a blink, another person's nervous system has already begun answering a question it didn't consciously choose to ask. Does this person matter? What this audiobook is about, all of it, beneath the techniques and frameworks, is learning to answer that question honestly and immediately. Not through performance, not through dominance, but through a quality of presence that most people spend their entire lives accidentally hiding. It can be developed. That's what the evidence shows, and that's where we begin. Before we go deeper, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it amazing how people from different parts of the world connect through these messages. Chapter 1. The 150 millisecond verdict. There's a study from Princeton you should know about. Participants were shown photographs of two political candidates for just 1/10 of a second, a flash, barely a glimpse, and asked to judge who looked more competent. Their snap judgments predicted actual election outcomes with about 70% accuracy. These weren't informed voters weighing policy positions. They were strangers making unconscious calls in less time than it takes to register you've seen something at all. This is the environment every interaction happens inside, and most people are completely unprepared for it. The brain's threat detection architecture, centered in the amygdala, operating far below conscious awareness, evolved over millions of years to answer one question faster than thought. Is this safe or dangerous? Above me or below me? Worth attention or not? It doesn't wait for you to speak. It reads posture, facial muscle tension, movement quality, spatial claiming, vocal resonance. Hundreds of signals processed in parallel, collapsed into a single felt sense before your first sentence is out. By the time someone's prefrontal cortex engages to evaluate what you're actually saying, the limbic system has already filed its verdict. Kahneman called these two systems of thinking fast and slow. System 1, fast, automatic, associative, handles most of the social world before System 2 even wakes up. The critical insight Kahneman's work points toward, and that most people miss entirely, is this. System 2 doesn't automatically override System 1. It justifies it. Once the fast system has generated a feeling about you, capable, uncertain, powerful, anxious, the slow system goes looking for evidence that confirms that feeling. This is what psychologists call the halo effect. First impression doesn't just color subsequent judgment, it actively recruits evidence in its own defense. And here's the part that matters most practically. Research shows that snap judgments are updatable, but only when the observer has both the motivation and the cognitive bandwidth to revise them. In a low-stakes casual encounter, they almost never do. In a high-stakes meeting where they're already managing their own anxiety, they almost certainly can't. This means you don't get a second first impression in the moments that matter most. The 150 milliseconds is the whole game. Understanding this should shift something in how you approach preparation. Not wardrobe preparation, though that's not irrelevant, but state preparation. The question isn't what will I say first, it's what signal will my nervous system broadcast before I say anything at all. The neurochemistry underneath this is worth understanding plainly. When someone's amygdala detects signals, it codes as high status, stillness without rigidity, space claimed without apology, eye contact that doesn't flinch or grasp. Cortisol in the observer actually decreases. They feel, without knowing why, slightly more comfortable, slightly more inclined toward openness. Dopamine edges upward. Being near someone who reads as confident and grounded is, neurochemically, a mild reward. The brain registers it as a resource, not a threat. The reverse is equally true and considerably less discussed. When someone enters with contracted posture, eyes scanning for permission, voice pitched upward at the ends of statements, the observer's cortisol ticks up. Not dramatically, subtly. A faint background hum of something's off here. They pull back slightly. They evaluate more critically. They give less, and they usually have no idea why. I'll say something here I don't fully like admitting. I spent years believing that if I was genuinely competent, genuinely prepared, genuinely good at what I did, the room would eventually figure that out. It took longer than it should have to understand that the room isn't running an audit. It's running a feeling. This doesn't mean the content of your character is irrelevant. It means the signal has to precede the proof. Competence that can't be sensed before it's demonstrated is competence that spends its whole career asking to be seen. The practical implication is specific. In the 2 minutes before any significant interaction, a meeting, a conversation, a room you're walking into, your job isn't to rehearse what you'll say. It's to notice your current physiological state and adjust it deliberately. Slow your breathing. Let your feet find the floor. Drop your shoulders to where they actually belong, not where tension has been holding them. Allow your face to settle into neutral rather than the slightly pinched expression that anticipatory anxiety produces without your permission. This isn't performance, it's regulation. You are bringing your nervous system to a state that will broadcast calm competence, because your nervous system is broadcasting constantly, whether you intend it to or not. The Princeton candidates whose faces flickered on a screen for 1/10 of a second, they weren't doing anything. They weren't speaking, weren't arguing, weren't demonstrating expertise. They were simply being perceived. And something in how they occupied their own faces, their own stillness, communicated enough that strangers could feel in that fraction of a moment, that one. You can develop that quality. It isn't charisma. It isn't confidence in the motivational poster sense. It's the specific neurological signal that says, I am not bracing for this. I was already here. The verdict happens fast. But what you walk in carrying, that you get to choose. Chapter 2. The energy you carry before you speak. Watch someone who needs the room to like them. You'll see it immediately, not in anything dramatic, but in the small, constant adjustments. The laugh that arrives slightly too quickly. The sentence that trails upward into a question when it wasn't one. The way their eyes move during a pause, checking for signs of approval or rejection. They're not doing anything wrong exactly. They're doing something very human. But the room reads it like a frequency, and the frequency says, I need something from you. The moment that signal goes out, the dynamic is set, and it almost never recovers in the same interaction. Stephen Porges spent decades developing what he called Polyvagal Theory, and while the full architecture is complex, the relevant insight is this. Your autonomic nervous system doesn't just regulate your internal state, it broadcasts it. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from brainstem to gut, governs what Porges called the social engagement system. When it's well regulated, your face is subtly mobile, your voice carries prosody, your eyes soften at the right moments. You appear, without trying, safe and present. When it's dysregulated, when you're running a low-grade threat response because the stakes feel high and approval feels uncertain, the same system flattens. Your voice loses variability, your face tightens, your eye contact either grabs or avoids. Other nervous systems read this immediately and unconsciously code it as something's off. What gets labeled neediness or low confidence or nervous energy is very often not a character trait. It's a physiological state. The distinction matters because states can be changed. Traits take considerably longer. The concept worth building here is what the source material calls centered presence, but it's worth being more precise about what that actually means physiologically. Centered presence is a state in which your emotional equilibrium is generated internally rather than extracted from the responses of others. You're not waiting to see how the room receives you before deciding how you feel about being there. You arrived already decided. This doesn't mean indifferent to others. Quite the opposite. It means you can be genuinely curious about and attentive to other people without depending on their reaction to feel stable. That distinction is everything. The difference between reactive and responsive energy is real, and it runs deeper than behavior. Reactive energy is downstream of a nervous system that has identified the social environment as a potential threat to status, to belonging, to self-image. From that state, everything gets processed through a filter of how does this affect me? Responsive energy comes from a regulated state where the threat response is quiet enough that you can actually perceive what's happening around you rather than just reacting to it. You receive information, you process it, you choose. The practical question is how to get there deliberately, especially when the stakes are real and the pressure is genuine. Breath is the fastest tool available, and not because it's relaxing in a general sense. The specific mechanism is this. An exhale that's longer than your inhale directly activates the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Done subtly, not as a visible exercise, but as a quiet internal reset, this shifts your autonomic state within roughly 90 seconds. Your voice changes. Your face changes. The broadcast changes before you've said a word or changed a thought. Physical grounding adds another layer. The sensation of your feet on the floor, your weight dropping downward rather than being held up by a shoulder tension, this is not metaphor. Proprioceptive input from the lower body signals to the brain that the ground exists, that you are supported, that you are not falling. It sounds almost too simple. But the nervous system doesn't evaluate the sophistication of inputs. It responds to them. The third piece is what the source calls energy boundaries, and what somatic psychology frames as differentiation. Highly reactive people don't just respond to their own emotional states, they absorb others. Walk into a tense room and immediately feel tense. Sit across from an anxious person and find your own chest tightening. This permeability isn't empathy, though it can masquerade as it. It's a poorly bounded nervous system doing what nervous systems do, mirroring. The development of differentiation, the ability to be fully present with another person's experience without being run by it, is one of the quieter and more powerful skills in this entire domain. You practice it not by becoming less sensitive, but by becoming more anchored. The image that works neurologically is not a wall, but a root system, deep enough that the surface can move freely without the whole structure tipping. Here is the uncomfortable truth about the approval trap that nobody frames this way. The people who most desperately want to be liked are frequently the least liked, not because they're unlikable, but because the wanting itself is visible, and visible wanting makes others feel responsible for your emotional state. That responsibility is a burden. People pull away from burdens even when they genuinely enjoy the person underneath one. The exit from the trap isn't to care less. It's to become the source of your own stability, so that what you bring to other people is presence, not need. That shift is felt before it's seen. The room knows before you speak. Chapter 3. The body that believes itself. Stand up straight. You've heard it so many times the instruction has gone numb. It's been flattened into posture advice, into something your mother said, into a thing you do briefly in front of mirrors, and then forget the moment you sit down at your desk. But the actual mechanism underneath it is stranger and more powerful than good posture has any right to be. The body doesn't just display your internal state, it creates it. This is the finding that survived the long, complicated aftermath of Amy Cuddy's power pose research. The specific hormone ratios she reported, testosterone up, cortisol down after 2 minutes of expansive posture, didn't replicate cleanly. That's the part most people remember, and most people use to dismiss the whole line of inquiry. What did replicate consistently across multiple labs and methodologies is that adopting expansive open posture changes how people feel about themselves and how they perform on subsequent tasks. Not dramatically, not magically, but measurably. The body is upstream of the emotion in a way that our intuitive model, I feel confident therefore I stand tall, gets exactly backwards. William James proposed this in 1884. We don't tremble because we're afraid. We're afraid because we tremble. The somatic marker hypothesis, developed by Antonio Damasio over a century later, gave it neuroscientific grounding. The brain continuously monitors the body's state and uses that data as input for emotional experience. Change the body's signal, and the emotional experience follows, partially, gradually, but genuinely. What this means practically is that your posture isn't communicating your confidence to other people while leaving your actual experience of yourself unchanged. It's participating in generating your confidence or undermining it moment by moment throughout the day. The spine you hold at 9 a.m. is shaping the emotional tone you bring to the 11 a.m. meeting in ways you'll never consciously trace. Physical sovereignty, the ability to occupy your own body and the space around it without apology or excessive accommodation, begins with the spine. Not military rigidity, which is its own kind of performance and carries its own kind of tension. The quality you're after is elongated ease, the crown of the head rising, the ribcage open, the lower back finding its natural curve rather than collapsing into a chair or bracing against anxiety. This alignment creates what movement specialists call integrated strength, where the structure supports itself rather than requiring constant muscular effort to maintain. The shoulders deserve specific attention because they're where most people carry both their stress and their social anxiety in the same storage unit. Rounded forward shoulders don't just signal submissiveness to observers. They compress the chest, restrict breathing, and via the vagus nerve, keep the nervous system in a slightly activated state. It's a posture that self-perpetuates the feeling it expresses. Rolling the shoulders back and allowing them to settle, not forcing them back with effort, but letting them drop to where the skeleton actually wants them, opens the chest and shifts the breathing pattern, which shifts the nervous system state, which changes the broadcast. Facial expression sits at the intersection of communication and self-regulation in a way that's easy to underestimate. The jaw holds more unconscious tension than almost any other part of the face, and that tension creates a hardness that reads as either cold or guarded, even when the person behind it is neither. Allowing the jaw to soften, not slacken, soften, releases a quality of approachability that coexists perfectly with authority. The most compelling faces are those that are simultaneously present and relaxed, not performing openness, not performing composure, just occupying the face from the inside. Eye contact is its own conversation. The quality that commands respect isn't duration, it's steadiness. The ability to hold someone's gaze without looking away in search of approval, and without the slight aggressive intensity of someone trying to prove something. Steady eye contact says, "I see you, and I'm comfortable being seen." It's one of the more intimate acts available in ordinary social life, which is exactly why most people either avoid it or overdo it. Movement quality separates people who project authority from people who merely dress the part. Rushed, fragmented movement, decisions made halfway through and reversed, gestures that start and stop, the trajectory of someone navigating by anxiety, reads as internal disorganization. Deliberate movement isn't slow movement, it's movement that completes itself. Each gesture arrives, does its work, and finishes. The person sitting down does so as if they intended to. The person crossing a room does so without the slightly apologetic quality that says, "I hope I'm not in your way." This is what proxemics ultimately comes down to, not just how much space you take up, but whether you take it up as if you're allowed to. High-status individuals don't claim more physical space through aggression. They claim appropriate space without the flinch of someone waiting to be told they've taken too much. One private thing worth saying here, the first time I consciously practiced walking into a room differently, slower, more deliberate, without the low-grade scan for signals about whether I belonged, it felt almost theatrical, like I was pretending. What I didn't understand then was that the pretending was what I'd been doing before. Shrinking into rooms, taking up less space than I was entitled to, moving like I wasn't sure of my welcome, that was the performance. The other thing was just stopping. The body that believes itself is not performing confidence. It has simply stopped performing its absence. Chapter 4. How you sound before they hear what you say. Before the meaning of your words registers, the sound of your voice has already done its work. This isn't a communication tip. It's a neurological fact about sequencing. The auditory cortex processes paralinguistic features, pitch, rhythm, resonance, pace, in a different pathway than the language centers. By the time the brain has decoded what you said, it has already formed a judgment about who you are from how you said it. The content arrives into a room the voice already furnished. Most voice advice focuses on pitch. Speak lower, project authority. Don't sound like you're asking a question when you're making a statement. This is not wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that leads people to sound forced rather than authoritative. The research on vocal leadership perception is more specific and more interesting. It's pitch variability, not just pitch depth, that predicts perceived leadership quality. Monotone voices, regardless of how low they are, read as either bored or anxious. The voices we associate with authority have range. They move, they land, they emphasize through variation rather than volume. They sound like someone who is genuinely engaged with what they're saying, which means the voice problem is often not a mechanical problem, it's a presence problem. When someone speaks in a flattened, variable-free tone, they're frequently dissociated from their own content, going through the motions of communication while internally managing anxiety about how it's landing. The fix isn't vocal exercises in isolation, it's the return of genuine engagement with the ideas being expressed, which naturally restores the prosody that anxiety flattened. Uptalk, the rising intonation at the end of declarative statements, turning them into implied questions, is perhaps the single most costly vocal habit for perceived authority. It's worth understanding why people develop it, because dismissing it as a bad habit misses the function it's serving. Uptalk is a social lubricant. It softens assertions, invites agreement, signals that you're not trying to dominate the conversation. In cultures and contexts where harmony is prized over hierarchy, it serves a genuine purpose. But in situations where you need your ideas taken seriously, where you need people to feel they're receiving information from someone who knows what they're talking about, it works against you completely. The statement that ends going up is asking for permission to have been said. The statement that ends going down has already arrived. Pace carries status signals that most people don't consciously register but immediately respond to. Speaking quickly reads as one of two things. Either the person is excited, which can be compelling, or they're afraid of being interrupted before they finish, which reads as low status. The underlying message of rushed speech is, I'm not sure I have the floor, and I'm trying to get my words out before someone takes it from me. Slowing down communicates the opposite. It says the floor is yours, you know it, and you're not concerned about losing it. This is why powerful people in negotiations will sometimes speak with an almost disconcerting deliberateness. Not to frustrate, to demonstrate that time is theirs. The mechanics of a resonant voice are worth understanding briefly. Voice originates not in the throat, but in the entire respiratory column. Shallow chest breathing, which is the default state for most people under any social pressure, produces a thin, slightly constricted voice that the ear reads as tense. Diaphragmatic breathing, where the belly expands on the inhale, creates a fuller support for the voice and allows it to resonate in the chest cavity rather than being squeezed through the throat. The result isn't just a different sound, it's a different felt quality, something the listener's own body responds to, because resonant sound has physical properties that thin sound lacks. Strategic pausing deserves more than a paragraph because it's the most underused tool available and the one that separates genuinely commanding communicators from technically proficient ones. Most people treat silence as a failure state, something that has to be filled before it becomes embarrassing. This is the anxiety reading. The authority reading of silence is entirely different. Primatologist Franz de Waal observed that in chimpanzee social groups, dominant individuals are comfortable being looked at without responding. The pause is not a gap, it's a claim. It says, I'm not rushed by your expectation. In human conversation, the deliberate pause before an important point creates anticipation. The pause after it creates weight. Both require the speaker to be comfortable with silence in a way that most people aren't, which is exactly why those who are read as having something the others don't. And then there is what you choose not to say. Filler words, like, sort of, kind of, are the acoustic equivalent of the approval-seeking behaviors we discussed in posture and energy. They exist to fill space, to maintain your claim on the floor without quite committing to what's going to fill it. Eliminating them doesn't require some dramatic rewiring. It requires only being willing to let silence stand in their place, which returns us to the comfort with pausing that the whole chapter points toward. Your voice is not a separate thing from your presence. It is its sound. Chapter 5. Language that commands without demanding. Here is a sentence most people have said, or some version of it, in a meeting that mattered. I just think maybe we could possibly consider looking at this a slightly different way, if that makes sense. Count the escapes. Just minimizing before you've begun. Think, softening certainty into opinion. Maybe apologizing for the suggestion. Possibly apologizing for the apology. If that makes sense. Handing the other person the authority to decide whether your idea deserved to exist. 7 words of content buried inside a sentence that spent its entire length trying not to impose. This isn't a communication habit. It's a psychological state expressed in grammar. Stephen Hayes, the psychologist who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, spent decades studying how language and thought interact with anxiety. One of ACT's central observations is what Hayes calls cognitive fusion, the state in which you become so identified with your anxious thoughts that you can no longer distinguish between the thought and the reality it's describing. When someone is fused with the thought, my idea might be wrong and people might judge me for it, they don't just think that thought privately. It leaks into every sentence. The hedges aren't stylistic choices, they're the grammatical shape of fear. And the person across the table hears not just the words, but the state underneath them, and adjusts their confidence in you accordingly. The exit from this isn't to pretend certainty you don't have. That produces a different kind of false note, the brittle over-assertion of someone compensating. The exit is what Hayes calls diffusion, creating enough psychological distance from the anxious thought that you can speak from your actual position rather than from the fear of how your position will land. The practical form of this is surprisingly simple. Before you speak, locate what you actually think, not what you think will be well received, not the version of your idea that's been pre-softened for a hostile audience. And say that, directly, with a period at the end. Authority-based language doesn't require aggression or certainty beyond what you actually possess. It requires only that your words carry the same weight as your actual level of conviction. If you're certain, speak certainly. If you're genuinely uncertain, say "I don't know yet," which is completely different from hedging what you do know. Intellectual honesty about the edges of your knowledge actually strengthens credibility. What destroys it is the performance of uncertainty about things you're not actually uncertain about, deployed as a social buffer. Precision in language is a form of respect for the listener and for the idea. Vague language doesn't just communicate unclearly. It signals that the speaker hasn't fully worked through their own thinking. Compare the project had some issues with timing to we missed the delivery date by 11 days because the review process had no defined owner. The second sentence is harder to say. It's specific, it assigns cause, it can be argued with. That's exactly why it commands attention. It has committed to something. Commitment, even to a position someone might disagree with, reads as strength. Vagueness reads as someone who hasn't yet decided whether to show up. Strategic questions operate on a different level than most people understand them to. The common understanding is that questions gather information. That's true, but it's the least interesting thing questions do. In skilled hands, a question restructures how someone is thinking. It doesn't just ask for their current conclusion, it changes the cognitive frame inside which they're operating. What would need to be true for this approach to work is a different question than do you think this will work? The first opens architecture. The second calls for a verdict on existing structure. The most effective strategic questions share a common feature. They invite the other person to think alongside you rather than to report to you. This creates intellectual partnership rather than interrogation, which produces both better thinking and stronger alignment. When someone arrives at a conclusion by working through it themselves, guided by questions you asked, they own that conclusion in a way they never would if you'd simply stated it. Persuasion that leaves no fingerprints is the most durable kind. Question timing matters as much as content. Early in a conversation, a well-placed question establishes you as someone who thinks in terms of systems and consequences rather than just immediate positions. It signals, I'm here to understand the full picture, not just to push my agenda. Mid-conversation, questions can interrupt escalating conflict by shifting focus from defended positions to underlying interests. The distinction Roger Fisher built an entire negotiation methodology around. At the close of important conversations, a simple, "What are we each walking away committed to?" transforms discussion into accountability without requiring you to police anyone. One thing worth naming directly: conversational leadership, genuinely guiding a discussion toward better outcomes, is almost never recognized as power in the moment. The person who asks the clarifying question that unlocks a stuck meeting rarely gets credited for the unlock. The person who makes the loudest argument usually does. This is a short-term perception problem that resolves over time. Patterns are visible even when individual instances aren't. After enough meetings, people know whose presence made things clearer and whose made things louder. They begin to need the former and merely tolerate the latter. Language that commands doesn't raise its voice. It simply means what it says and says what it means, without the long corridor of qualifications that announces, before you've even arrived at your point, that you're not sure you're allowed to have one. You are. Say the thing. Chapter 6. Staying whole when pressure hits. Someone is criticizing you in a meeting, or they're dismissing your idea before you've finished explaining it, or they're raising their voice in a way that makes the room go quiet and look at you to see what you'll do. In these moments, these specific, visceral, heart rate spiking moments, everything else in this book becomes either real or theoretical. This is where the work proves itself. The physiology of what happens under social threat is worth knowing precisely, because vague awareness of stress is far less useful than specific understanding of the mechanism. When your status is challenged or your belonging feels threatened, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates within milliseconds. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the system. The amygdala, already fast, already operating below conscious thought, gets faster and louder. Simultaneously, blood flow redirects away from the prefrontal cortex toward the motor systems. Your capacity for nuanced thinking, long-range consideration, and empathic reading of others actually decreases measurably in real time. You become, for a window of seconds to minutes, a slightly less sophisticated version of yourself precisely when the situation demands your best. Most people don't know this is happening. They just find themselves saying something defensive, or going flat and silent, or agreeing to something they didn't mean to agree to, and then, 20 minutes later in the elevator, thinking of exactly what they should have said. The French call this l'esprit de l'escalier, the staircase wit. The response that arrives after you've already left the building. What Ethan Kross discovered in his research on emotional regulation offers one of the most practical interventions available for this specific problem. When people narrate their own experience using their own name, not "I'm feeling attacked," but "Getrick," what's actually happening here? The psychological distance created by that shift measurably reduces amygdala activation. It's not a trick. It's a structural change in perspective. Moving from first-person immersion to third-person observation accesses the same neural pathways used when we reason about other people's problems, which we almost always do more clearly than we reason about our own. The self-distancing isn't detachment. It's clarity. Viktor Frankl, writing from an experience of suffering that dwarfs most of what we'll ever face, observed that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our growth. This gets quoted often as inspiration. It deserves to be understood as neuroscience. That space is real. It's the window between amygdala activation and behavioral response, and it can be expanded, not infinitely, not instantly, but genuinely, through practice. Every time you introduce a pause between provocation and response, you are literally strengthening the neural pathway that makes future pauses easier. The space Frankl described isn't poetic. It's prefrontal real estate you can develop. Tactical breathing is the fastest tool for expanding that space in real time. The mechanism, again, is specific. The extended exhale activates the vagus nerve, which puts the parasympathetic brake on the sympathetic activation that cortisol and adrenaline set off. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Done invisibly, mid-conversation, this can restore enough prefrontal function to change your response from reactive to chosen. Not perfectly, not every time, but often enough to matter. The difference between a response you chose and one that happened to you is the entire difference between a reputation for composure and a reputation for volatility. Mental reframing under pressure is not positive thinking. It's a deliberate cognitive intervention that changes what the nervous system is responding to. The challenge, the criticism, the provocative question. These are not inherently threats. They're events. The meaning assigned to them is a choice, even if it doesn't feel like one. When someone challenges your position in a meeting, 2 interpretations are available, and both are technically accurate. They're attacking me, or they're engaging seriously enough with my idea to argue with it. The first interpretation activates defense. The second activates thinking. You cannot hold both simultaneously. You get to choose which room you walk into. The practice of strategic non-reactivity isn't passivity. It's timing. That's worth considering. Let me think about that for a moment. This phrase does several things at once. It removes the urgency that reactive exchanges depend on. It communicates that your responses are considered rather than reflexive, and it gives your nervous system the seconds it needs to bring the prefrontal cortex back online. Often, in that pause, the other person's emotional charge begins to dissipate on its own. Aggression, fed by immediate reaction, escalates. Aggression, met with calm stillness, frequently doesn't know what to do next. Here's the private thing. The moments I'm least proud of professionally are not the moments I failed at a task. They're the moments I got rattled in public and responded from that rattled state. Too quickly, too defensively, with a sharpness that wasn't strategy, it was just injury expressing itself. The preparation for those moments isn't motivational. It's physiological. You don't think your way into composure when you need it. You train the nervous system to find it before you need it, so it's available when you do. Pressure doesn't build character. It reveals what the character was made of all along. Which means the work happens now, in ordinary moments, building the nervous system that will be present when the extraordinary ones arrive. Chapter 7. Influence that doesn't leave a residue. There is a quality that the best influencers share that is almost impossible to articulate while it's happening, but completely recognizable in retrospect. When you've been genuinely influenced by someone who operates at this level, you don't walk away feeling moved or convinced or persuaded. You walk away feeling like you thought more clearly than usual, like the conversation helped you see something you'd been half seeing for a while. The influence leaves no fingerprints because it didn't push. It illuminated. This is the distinction that matters most in this entire domain, and it's one that most treatments of persuasion and influence never quite reach. The difference between manipulation and ethical influence is not just moral, it's neurochemical, it's detectable. Franz de Waal spent 40 years observing primate social behavior, and what emerges from that body of work is a picture of reciprocal altruism so ancient and so embedded in social mammal biology that it precedes language, culture, and conscious strategy by millions of years. When a chimpanzee grooms another, shares food, or intervenes in a conflict on another's behalf, what follows is not calculated return, but return happens. The social ledger isn't kept consciously. It's kept somatically in the felt sense of obligation and connection that genuine generosity produces. Humans inherited this system intact. When someone provides you with something genuinely valuable, insight, access, assistance, you feel it as a pull toward reciprocity that doesn't require reasoning about. It's older than reasoning. The key word is genuinely. This is where the neurochemical detection system becomes relevant. When someone provides help or value in a way that is transactional, when the underlying motive is return rather than contribution, most people feel it. Not always consciously, not always accurately, but often enough that the strategy undermines itself. The tell is usually in the timing and framing of the ask. Genuine generosity is patient. It doesn't immediately present an invoice. It contributes to a relationship and trusts the relationship to bear fruit. Calculated reciprocity moves too quickly toward the return and leaves a residue, a slight oiliness in the interaction that people respond to without being able to name. Building genuine influence through value creation requires developing a specific kind of attention. What does this person actually need, not what would make them feel good about me? These are often different. Flattery provides the second. Useful truth, a well-timed introduction, a piece of information that solves a real problem. These provide the first. The former is cheap, and people know it. The latter is rare, and people remember it. Social proof operates in group contexts with a force that most individuals consistently underestimate. The reason is evolutionary. In a complex social environment with incomplete information, which describes every professional context anyone has ever inhabited, tracking what respected others do is an efficient heuristic for navigating uncertainty. When people whose judgment you trust treat someone as credible and worth attention, your prior toward that person updates automatically. This isn't gullibility. It's Bayesian reasoning running on old hardware. The sophisticated application of social proof isn't collecting endorsements. It's building genuine relationships with people whose esteem means something in the specific context where you need to operate. This takes longer than acquiring credentials. It also lasts longer. A reputation vouched for by two people whose judgment is trusted carries more weight than a wall of formal qualifications, because the vouching answers a different question. Credentials say, this person met a standard. Endorsement from respected peers says, this person is someone I'd stake my own reputation on. That's a much stronger signal. Authority positioning, establishing genuine credibility without the awkward performance of self-promotion, happens most naturally through your questions and your problems, not through your answers and your achievements. The questions someone asks reveal the depth of their understanding more reliably than the answers they give, because good questions require seeing the full terrain. When you ask a question that no one else in the room thought to ask, you demonstrate expertise more convincingly than if you delivered a 10-minute monologue about your qualifications. The scarcity principle, handled ethically, comes down to one thing: respecting your own time and attention enough to be selective about where you direct them. This isn't a tactic, it's a value. When you say no to requests that don't align with your actual priorities, clearly, without excessive apology, you communicate that your yes means something. The yes of someone who never says no is worth considerably less than the yes of someone who is known to decline. This is not strategy dressed as principle. It's principle that happens to produce a strategic effect. The consistency principle, people's drive to behave in accordance with their stated positions, is most ethically used not to lock people into corners, but to help them discover alignment between what they say they value and what a specific decision actually requires. The question is not "you said X, so you have to do Y." The question is, given what you've said matters to you, how does this choice look? That's not manipulation. That's holding up a mirror. Influence that leaves no residue doesn't work by overcoming people's resistance. It works by making resistance unnecessary, by creating conditions in which the other person's own clearest thinking arrives at a conclusion they genuinely own. That's not a technique. That's a quality of relationship. Chapter 8. Reading the room without reducing the person. The 4-type personality model in the source material, driver, analytical, expressive, amiable, is genuinely useful. It's also genuinely dangerous if you stop thinking the moment you've applied a label. Here's what typology does well. It gives you a framework for noticing that not everyone processes information, makes decisions, or experiences social interaction the same way you do. This sounds obvious. It isn't in practice. The default human tendency is to communicate with others the way we ourselves would want to be communicated with, which works reliably for perhaps 30% of the people we encounter and mystifies the rest. A map of personality types interrupts that default. It reminds you to look before you speak. Here's what it does poorly. It treats people as fixed configurations rather than dynamic states. The same person who needs detailed analysis before making a major financial decision may need quick, direct framing when they're under deadline pressure. The colleague who responds best to relational warmth in one-on-one conversation may need structured information in a group setting where they're managing how they appear to others. The category gives you a starting hypothesis. The conversation, if you're actually paying attention to it, tells you when to revise. Carl Jung, whose original work on psychological types underpins most modern personality frameworks, was more nuanced about this than his popularizers have been. Jung's types were not descriptions of what people are, but of what people prefer. And preferences, he was careful to note, exist on spectrums that shift with context, development, and age. The pop psychology version hardened his fluid observations into fixed boxes, and in doing so, lost the most important thing he was pointing at, that what we call personality is partly temperament, partly history, and partly the ongoing negotiation between who we are and what our current situation requires. What this means practically is that the deepest skill isn't identifying a driver or an analytical. It's tracking what this specific person needs from this specific conversation, which is a question you answer by listening rather than by categorizing. Listening at this level requires distinguishing between content and process. Content is what someone is saying. Process is how they're saying it. The pace, the emotional texture, what they return to, what they skip over, where their energy rises and where it flattens. Most people attend almost entirely to content and miss the process, almost entirely, which means they respond to the stated question while the real one goes unanswered. When someone who usually speaks quickly slows down on a particular point, they're flagging something that matters more than what surrounds it. When someone who is typically direct suddenly becomes vague or indirect, there's something in that territory they're not yet ready to say plainly. When someone repeats a concern 3 times while nominally agreeing to move forward, the agreement is provisional at best. These are process signals. They require you to be present enough in the conversation to notice them, which requires that the part of your mind that's composing your next response is quiet long enough to actually receive what's being transmitted. The adaptation itself, adjusting your communication style to meet someone where they are, is worth distinguishing from 2 things it's sometimes confused with. It's not people-pleasing, which involves changing your substance to match what someone wants to hear. Adaptation changes your delivery while leaving your substance intact. A difficult message can be delivered bluntly to someone who explicitly values directness, or with more contextual framing to someone who needs the surrounding picture before they can hear the center. The message is the same. The path to it varies, and it's not performance or manipulation because it serves the other person's ability to actually receive and use what you're offering. You're not changing the signal. You're adjusting the frequency to cut through interference. The risk the source material doesn't name is what happens when people use personality typology as a permission structure for their own preferences. The person who decides someone is an analytical and proceeds to bury them in data, never noticing that this particular person on this particular day, in this particular high-pressure moment, needs simplicity and a clear recommendation, isn't demonstrating social intelligence. They're demonstrating that they learned a framework and stopped observing. The honest version of social intelligence is considerably more uncomfortable than having a 4-type model because it requires you to stay uncertain for longer. To hold your initial read loosely. To notice when your hypothesis about a person is being contradicted by the evidence in front of you and update accordingly. This is the same cognitive move that distinguishes a good scientist from a bad one, and it's equally rare in social contexts as in laboratories. Read people carefully, read them continuously, and be willing always to be wrong about what you thought you'd already figured out. That willingness to keep looking rather than having already seen is itself a form of respect that most people immediately feel, even if they couldn't tell you why. Chapter 9. The reputation you build in rooms you've already left. Reputation is not what you think it is. Most people conceive of it as an accumulation. Good acts deposited over time, building into a kind of social credit score that reflects the sum of what you've contributed. This is not how it works. The architecture of reputation is asymmetric in a way that changes everything about how it should be built and protected. Roy Baumeister's research on the asymmetry of good and bad events established something that, once you understand it, you cannot unsee. Negative information is processed more thoroughly, weighted more heavily, and retained longer than equivalent positive information. One serious ethical failure costs more reputational ground than many ethical successes gain. The psychological term is negativity bias, and while it operates everywhere in human cognition, it operates with particular force in moral judgment. People extend generous credit slowly, they withdraw it fast. What this means structurally is that your reputation is built less by what you accomplish and more by what you refuse to do when refusing is costly. Anyone can maintain their standards when maintaining them is easy. What gets noticed, what gets encoded into long-term reputation, is the choice made when compromising would have been understandable, even justifiable, and you didn't. This is not a call to self-righteous inflexibility. It's an observation about what trustworthiness actually signals. Trust, at its foundation, is a prediction. I believe this person will behave consistently with their stated values even when I'm not watching, even when it's inconvenient, even when the incentives point elsewhere. Every time you validate that prediction, especially when it costs you something, you deepen the trust. Every time you invalidate it, even slightly, even for good reasons, you don't just lose what you spent. You trigger a recalibration that raises the question of what else might be unreliable. Behavioral consistency, then, is not the same as rigidity. It's the maintenance of a recognizable core, a set of principles that others can reliably locate in you across different contexts, pressures, and circumstances. You can change your mind. You can grow. You can admit you were wrong. None of these threaten the foundation as long as the underlying values remain visible and stable. What destroys reputation is not evolution, but incoherence, the sense that this person's behavior is governed by whatever the current situation seems to require, rather than by anything that runs deeper. Intellectual honesty is perhaps the most undervalued component of long-term respect, partly because it involves a short-term cost that most people aren't willing to pay. Admitting you don't know something in a culture that rewards the performance of certainty feels like exposure. Changing your position when confronted with better evidence in an environment where consistency is often confused with strength can feel like defeat. But the people who are genuinely trusted over long careers are almost always those who have demonstrated that their intellectual commitments are to truth rather than to their own previous statements. They update, they attribute credit accurately. They say I was wrong about that in the same tone they'd use to say anything else. Matter of fact, undefended, moving forward. This matters more than it seems, because it answers a question everyone who works with you is implicitly asking. Can I rely on what this person tells me? The person who defends positions they've privately abandoned, who claims knowledge they don't have, who attributes others' contributions to themselves. They may perform confidence effectively, but they create a slow erosion of reliability in everyone around them. People stop bringing them real problems because they've learned they'll get managed rather than helped. Strategic value creation, becoming someone whose involvement reliably improves outcomes, requires understanding the difference between what people ask for and what they actually need. These are frequently not the same. Someone who asks for reassurance about a decision they've already made may actually need someone willing to examine the decision honestly. Someone who asks for a contact may actually need help clarifying what they're trying to accomplish before they speak to anyone. The value you provide when you address the real need rather than the stated request is categorically different from the value of simply delivering what was asked. One makes you useful. The other makes you indispensable. Network cultivation in service of long-term reputation is almost the opposite of what the word networking usually implies. The transactional model, collect contacts, exchange favors, leverage relationships for advancement, produces a thin web that everyone involved can feel the thinness of. What produces genuine social capital is a simpler and considerably less strategic orientation, genuine interest in other people's problems, and genuine pleasure in helping solve them. When this is real, it compounds. People speak well of you in rooms where your name comes up, not because you've managed them into it, but because their experience of knowing you has been consistently good. The digital dimension of reputation adds a layer that previous generations didn't have to manage. Your online presence is not a separate thing from your reputation. It's a permanent, searchable, quotable extension of it. What you say in a professional forum at 11 p.m. when you're tired and irritated is archived with the same fidelity as your best work. The standard worth applying is the same one Buffett reportedly offered to young managers. Would you be comfortable if this appeared on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper? The test isn't whether it's technically defensible, it's whether it represents the person you're actually trying to be. Here is the quiet truth that underlies all of it. Reputation is not managed, it's inhabited. The gap between people with strong, long-term reputations and those without one is not usually a gap in strategy. It's a gap in how seriously they take ordinary moments, the small decisions, the routine interactions, the commitments that don't seem to matter much until, suddenly, they're the whole picture. Every room you leave is still constructing you. Chapter 10. Difficult People and the Traps They Set. Before we discuss how to handle difficult people, it's worth being precise about what makes them difficult. Because the word difficult covers an enormous range of behaviors, aggression, passive aggression, manipulation, hostility, chronic undermining, and, lumping them together, produces strategies that work poorly for all of them. The more useful question is, what is this specific behavior doing for this specific person in this specific context? Not because the answer excuses anything, but because understanding the function of difficult behavior is the fastest route to interrupting it. Lee Ross coined the term fundamental attribution error in 1977, and 40 years of subsequent research has not dented its central finding. When other people behave badly, we attribute it to their character. When we behave badly, we attribute it to our circumstances. The difficult colleague is aggressive because they're aggressive. We were short with someone because we were under pressure, hadn't slept, were dealing with something they didn't know about. This asymmetry isn't just unfair to other people, it's strategically costly because it consistently leads us to respond to the person rather than to the situation, which is usually where both the cause and the solution actually live. This doesn't mean absorbing bad behavior with a philosophical shrug. It means recognizing that the most effective response to aggression, manipulation, or passive resistance usually addresses the conditions producing it, rather than simply punishing the expression of it. These are not mutually exclusive. You can set a firm boundary on the behavior while remaining genuinely curious about what's driving it. Aggressive behavior in professional settings almost always has one of a few underlying structures. The person feels unheard and is escalating to be taken seriously. They feel threatened and are preemptively attacking, or they've learned through experience that aggression works and have never been given sufficient reason to update that learning. Each of these calls for a different approach, but all three share a common first move. Don't match the energy. The temptation when someone raises their voice or becomes hostile is to respond in kind, either with equivalent force or with visible retreat. Both confirm the behavior's effectiveness. The former escalates. The latter teaches them the volume that gets results. The calm containment approach, lowering your own voice, slowing your pace, addressing the substance while naming the behavior directly, works because it introduces a mismatch the aggressive pattern doesn't know how to process. I can see this matters to you. I'm going to need us to drop the volume before we can actually solve it. This sentence does several things simultaneously. It validates without capitulating. It establishes the condition for continued conversation. And it does so in a tone that signals you are neither frightened nor interested in escalating. The message to the room and to the person is, this doesn't destabilize me, and we're not continuing until it changes. Passive-aggressive behavior is in some ways harder to address because it operates through deniability. The missed deadline that is always accompanied by a reasonable excuse. The agreement given in the meeting that evaporates by the following week. The comment that is technically a question but lands as an accusation. Confronting the surface behavior directly usually produces more denial and more sophisticated concealment. What's more effective is naming the pattern rather than the instance. Not you missed this deadline, but I've noticed a recurring gap between what we agree to in meetings and what happens afterward, and I want to understand what's driving it. Pattern confrontation removes the escape route that instance confrontation leaves open, while still framing the conversation as problem-solving rather than prosecution. Unfair public criticism, being blamed for outcomes you didn't cause, in front of people whose opinion of you matters, triggers one of the strongest defensive responses in the social mammal repertoire. The instinct is immediate self-defense. The instinct is usually wrong, not because self-defense is inappropriate, but because reactive self-defense in public reads as exactly what the attacker wants it to read as: destabilization. Graceful accountability, taking responsibility for any genuine contribution to the problem, clarifying facts without aggression, pivoting to solutions, serves your reputation better than winning the argument in the moment. People watching a public conflict remember the emotional quality of the response far longer than the specific points scored. Integrity challenges. Being asked to participate in something that conflicts with your actual values are the tests that most directly shape long-term reputation, for the reasons discussed in the previous chapter. The specific trap they set is the reasonableness of each individual step. No one asks you to do something completely unconscionable in the first request. They ask for something slightly uncomfortable, then something slightly more so. Each step is only marginally worse than the last, and the distance from where you started is invisible until it's very large. The only reliable protection is drawing the line early, at the first uncomfortable step, rather than the one that finally feels like too much, because the line is always easier to hold before you've crossed it once. Micromanagement, finally, is rarely about the specific tasks being managed. It's about the manager's anxiety regarding outcomes they feel responsible for but not in control of. Responding to it as a power struggle, resisting the oversight, asserting your autonomy, becoming visibly irritated by the check-ins, confirms the anxiety rather than addressing it. The more effective move is treating the underlying concern directly, providing the information and evidence that allows the anxiety to quiet. Not indefinitely, not as permanent accommodation, but as the trust-building bridge between where you are now and the autonomy you're working toward. Difficult people are not puzzles to be solved. They're nervous systems responding to conditions. Understanding the conditions doesn't require you to accept the behavior. It just gives you somewhere more useful to aim. Chapter 11. Systems that make respect automatic. Willpower is not a character trait. It's a resource, and it depletes. Roy Baumeister established this in what became known as ego depletion research, the finding that self-regulatory capacity diminishes with use across the day, producing progressively worse decisions, reduced impulse control, and lower quality performance as cognitive resources drain. Later research complicated the picture somewhat, but the practical reality that anyone with genuine self-knowledge already understands remains intact. There are times of day when your best self shows up readily, and times when it requires considerably more effort than it should. Trying to maintain consistent high performance purely through motivation is fighting this biology. Designing your environment to require less self-regulation is working with it. This is what Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions established with striking clarity. When people form specific if-then plans, if this situation arises, then I will do this specific thing, their follow-through rate increases dramatically compared to people who hold the same general intention without the specific trigger-response structure. The reason is that implementation intentions effectively automate the decision. The situation becomes the cue. The response fires without requiring a fresh act of will each time. You've made the decision once, in advance, when you had full cognitive resources available. Every subsequent execution costs almost nothing. Applied to respect and professional presence, this principle is transformative. The goal isn't to summon exceptional performance from a depleted state. It's to design systems so that your baseline, The version of you that shows up on ordinary days without special effort already meets the standard you're aiming for. Environmental design is the most immediate lever. Your physical environment shapes your cognitive and emotional state continuously and largely without your awareness. A workspace that requires you to search for things creates low-level friction that accumulates across the day into a background hum of disorganization. Poor lighting produces fatigue faster than most people attribute to it. A cluttered visual field divides attention in ways that compromise the quality of focus available for important thinking. These are not dramatic effects, but they're constant, and constant small drains matter more than occasional large ones. Personal presentation systems deserve the same systematic attention. This doesn't mean elaborate grooming rituals or expensive clothing. It means making decisions about how you'll appear before the day begins, rather than during it. When your appearance requires no real-time decisions, that cognitive bandwidth is available for the conversations and choices that actually matter. The executive who lays out tomorrow's clothes tonight isn't being obsessive. They're preserving decision quality for the morning when decisions will need to be made. Communication protocols, predetermined standards for how you'll handle the routine mechanics of professional interaction, eliminate another large category of daily friction. Response time standards for different types of messages. Meeting preparation routines that are brief enough to actually use every time. Follow-up systems that ensure commitments you've made don't disappear into the gap between your intentions and your calendar. None of these are individually significant. Collectively, they constitute the difference between someone who is experienced as reliable and someone who is experienced as intermittently reliable, which is a reputation distinction that compounds over years. Gallwitzer's if-then structure applies directly here. If I commit to something in a meeting, I will write it down before the meeting ends. If I receive an email that requires more than 2 minutes to answer, I will schedule the time to answer it rather than leaving it open. If I'm about to respond to something that has made me angry, I will wait until the following morning. These aren't rules you follow through discipline. They're automated responses to recognize situations that you install once and then don't have to negotiate with yourself about repeatedly. Energy management as a system means understanding your own ultradian rhythms, the roughly 90-minute cycles of higher and lower cognitive alertness that run throughout the waking day, and scheduling accordingly. High-value cognitive work, important conversations, creative problem-solving, these belong in your peak windows. Administrative tasks, routine communication, low-stakes decisions. These can absorb the troughs without loss. Most people do the opposite, filling their best hours with email and their worst hours with the work that actually requires them at their best. Strategic rest is not laziness. It's the maintenance of the resource that everything else depends on. The buffer between meetings, 10 minutes, not 5. That allows the nervous system to reset rather than carrying the emotional residue of one conversation directly into the next. The deliberate transition ritual before an important interaction, whatever form it takes, that allows you to arrive present rather than still processing what you were just doing. The feedback loop that closes the system. Regular honest assessment of where your performance is drifting from your standards and why requires a specific kind of attention that is neither self-congratulation nor self-punishment. It's diagnostic. Something worked less well than it should have. What was the condition that produced that? Fatigue? Inadequate preparation? A situation that fell outside your existing if-then structures? The answer points to a design problem rather than a character problem, which means it has a design solution. The deepest insight in all of this is simple and easily underestimated. You are not trying to be exceptional through repeated acts of will. You are trying to make your ordinary, unremarkable self good enough that exceptional moments can emerge naturally from it. Systems don't produce greatness. They protect the conditions in which greatness becomes possible. Chapter 12. The group as a different animal. Something happens to people in groups that doesn't happen to them alone. The person who is thoughtful and measured in a one-on-one conversation becomes strangely performative in a meeting of 12. The colleague who privately agrees with your position argues against it publicly when a senior person is present. The individual who would never say something cruel becomes capable of group cruelty with no more prompting than shared laughter. Groups don't just aggregate individual behaviors. They produce behaviors that individuals alone would not generate. Understanding why changes how you navigate them. Mark Leary's sociometer theory proposes something that reframes the entire question of self-esteem. We tend to think of self-esteem as an internal assessment, how good we think we are. Leary argues it evolved as something more specific and more urgent, a real-time gauge of social inclusion and exclusion, calibrated to signal when belonging is at risk so that corrective social behavior can be deployed before exclusion becomes permanent. Self-esteem, in this view, isn't primarily about self-assessment. It's a social alarm system. And groups are the environment that triggers it most acutely, because groups are where belonging is most visibly granted and withheld. This explains the otherwise puzzling phenomenon of intelligent people saying things in meetings they'd never say in private. They're not thinking less clearly. They're managing a different priority, the real-time monitoring of their social standing within the group that pulls cognitive resources away from the actual subject under discussion. The person who argues against a position they privately hold isn't necessarily spineless. They're responding to a threat signal their sociometer just generated. The person who becomes louder and more aggressive as the group grows isn't more confident. They're more anxious and expressing it through the social strategy that anxiety, historically, found effective. Knowing this, really knowing it, not just knowing it as a fact, changes how you experience group dynamics. When someone behaves differently in a group than they do alone, you stop being surprised and start being curious. What's the social threat they're managing? What does this group represent to them? What would need to be true about the environment for them to say what they actually think? Your own group behavior is worth examining with the same question. The ways you perform in groups, the opinions you soften, the positions you withhold, the personality you amplify for the room, are your sociometer responses. They're not who you are. They're who you become when the threat system activates and starts making decisions on your behalf. Recognizing the pattern is not the same as being free of it, but it's the necessary beginning. Strategic positioning in group settings starts with a physical and temporal decision most people make unconsciously. Where you sit and when you first speak. Positioning yourself where you can see and be seen by the key decision makers in the room, not just the formal leaders, but the informal ones whose responses others track, places you within the social field rather than at its margin. Sitting in corners, against walls, at the end of tables, communicates something about your relationship to the group's center before you've opened your mouth. It doesn't have to be aggressive claiming of space. It just has to be intentional. The timing of your first contribution shapes how everything subsequent is received. Entering too early before you've read the room's current state risks being out of sync with the conversation's actual temperature. Entering too late can forfeit the positions that shape the discussion's direction. The effective window is usually after the initial framing has been established and the first round of responses has revealed the terrain. Early enough to influence the trajectory, late enough to do so with genuine information about what the group actually needs from the conversation. Coalition building in groups happens in the white space, before meetings, in corridors, in the brief exchanges that most people treat as social filler. The positions that feel like organic consensus in a formal meeting are usually the product of multiple informal conversations that preceded it. Effective group operators understand this and invest in the informal layer as deliberately as they prepare for the formal one. Not to manipulate outcomes, but because decisions made in rooms where everyone is performing for everyone else are reliably worse than decisions shaped by genuine dialogue before the performance pressure begins. Facilitating group discussions, asking the clarifying question, naming the subtext that's been circling without landing, summarizing competing positions in a way that makes them legible to each other, is one of the most powerful things you can do in a group without appearing to do anything at all. It's invisible leadership. The room moves forward and doesn't quite know why. Over time, people begin to notice that things go better when you're present, and attribute it, often vaguely, to something about you. What they're actually noticing is that you're managing the group's process, while everyone else is managing only their own content. Managing your own sociometer in high-stakes group settings is ultimately a regulation problem of the same kind discussed in the chapter on pressure. The alarm is going off. The question is whether you let it drive your behavior or whether you hear it. Acknowledge what it's telling you about the social stakes and choose your response from a more considered position. Groups are not just collections of people. They're fields of social electricity, running currents that most people are unconsciously conducted by. The person who understands the current can move through it without being swept. That understanding begins with accepting that you're not immune to it either. Chapter 13. When everything is on fire. There is a specific quality of silence that falls over a room when something has gone seriously wrong. Not the comfortable silence of a meeting that's found its rhythm or the contemplative silence of people thinking. This silence has a texture. People go still in a way that's different from stillness. Eyes move without focusing. The ordinary social choreography, who speaks, when, how, suddenly has no script. And in that silence, every person in the room is running the same unconscious calculation. Who here knows what to do? The answer to that question is the entire subject of crisis leadership. And the answer is almost never the most senior person present, or the most credentialed, or the loudest. It's the person whose nervous system doesn't go offline when the pressure becomes extraordinary. Understanding what actually happens cognitively under extreme stress changes how you prepare for it. When cortisol floods the system at crisis levels, not the mild cortisol of a difficult meeting, but the acute cortisol of genuine emergency, the prefrontal cortex doesn't just slow down. Specific functions degrade in a specific sequence. The first casualties are nuance and complexity. The ability to hold multiple competing considerations simultaneously, to see situations from multiple perspectives, to anticipate second-order consequences. These go early. What persists considerably longer are pattern recognition, the ability to match current circumstances to previously encountered situations, and procedural memory, the execution of sequences that have been practiced to automaticity. This has a direct implication that most crisis leadership advice misses entirely. Trying to think your way through a novel crisis in real time using the full apparatus of nuanced analysis is asking your brain to perform its most sophisticated functions in the conditions where those functions are most degraded. What works is simpler. What does this situation most resemble that I've encountered before, and what did effective response look like then? Not because the analogy is perfect, it never is, but because pattern matching survives cortisol loads that destroy fresh analysis. This is why experienced crisis responders surgeons, firefighters, military leaders, emergency room physicians don't perform better under pressure because they're calmer than everyone else. They perform better because they've converted enough relevant knowledge into procedural memory that the degraded prefrontal cortex doesn't need to rebuild the response from scratch. The preparation happens before the crisis. The crisis is the execution. Operational calm is the most visible quality of effective crisis leaders and the most frequently misunderstood. It looks like emotional control. It's actually something more specific, the ability to maintain access to the cognitive functions that survive stress while fully acknowledging the reality and severity of what's happening. Not suppression, not denial. The person who appears unnervingly calm during a crisis because they're dissociated from it is dangerous. The person who appears calm because their regulatory systems are functioning well enough to keep the prefrontal cortex partially online, that person is valuable. The cognitive override technique begins with a recognition that is both simple and difficult to execute under pressure. You are not your stress response. The hammering heart, the narrowed vision, the urgency that feels like it demands immediate action. These are signals from an ancient system that evolved in environments where the right response to threat was almost always physical and immediate. Most modern crises require neither physical action nor immediacy. They require clear thinking over sustained periods. Recognizing the mismatch between what your nervous system is demanding and what the situation actually needs creates the fraction of space necessary to choose deliberate response over automatic reaction. Tactical breathing, as discussed earlier in this book, is the fastest neurological intervention available. In crisis contexts, it serves a specific additional function. It signals to everyone around you that you are regulated. The person in the room who is breathing slowly and visibly thinking, not frozen, not manic, but present and considered, becomes the attractor for others' nervous systems. Emotional contagion runs in both directions. Panic spreads through groups faster than almost any other social contagion. So does calm in the hands of someone with enough regulatory stability to generate it. Mental compartmentalization under extreme pressure involves a triage of attention rather than a suppression of reality. You're not pretending that the burning building has only one room. You're deciding consciously which room your attention serves best right now. What can I influence in the next 10 minutes is not a question that produces denial about the broader situation. It's a question that produces action rather than paralysis, which is what the broader situation usually needs most urgently. Crisis communication should be simpler, more direct, and more frequent than your normal register. People under stress lose access to the inferential processing that fills gaps in ambiguous communication. They need information stated explicitly. They need to know what's happening, what's being done about it, and specifically what you need from them. The authority tone, lower, slower, steady, does not just communicate composure. It activates composure in others through the mirror neuron systems that make emotional states contagious. The decision-making framework that works under genuine time pressure is not complicated analysis. It's a rapid triage of 3 questions. What do I know for certain? What is the most dangerous assumption I could make right now? And what action preserves the most future options? The third question is the most important and the most consistently neglected. In crisis, people reach for closure, a decision that ends the uncertainty. The better instinct is to reach for reversibility, the choice that doesn't foreclose better options when more information arrives 30 minutes from now. Here is the private thing about crisis. The people who perform best in them are almost never the people who imagined they would, the ones who rehearsed their heroism, the ones who were confident in advance about how they'd respond. The ones who perform best are usually the ones who had, in smaller moments across years, practiced staying present when their instinct was to flee, staying clear when their instinct was to panic, staying honest when their instinct was to manage. Crisis doesn't install character. It reveals the character that daily practice built long before the emergency arrived. The silence falls. The room waits. The question is what you've been building toward all along. Chapter 14, Respect Across Distance, Digital and Cultural. You evolved to read approximately 40 channels of social information simultaneously. Posture, micro-expressions, vocal prosody, physical proximity, the direction of someone's gaze, the tension in their jaw, whether their breath is shallow or full. All of it running in parallel, all of it contributing to the continuous felt sense of what's really happening in an interaction. This apparatus is 40,000 years old, refined across hundreds of thousands of social encounters, encoded in the genome, and it is extraordinarily good at what it does. A video call delivers roughly 6 of those channels, sometimes fewer. This isn't just an inconvenience or a limitation to work around. It's a deficit that triggers a mild but real threat response in the brain of every person on the call, because the social perceptual system is receiving far less information than it needs to feel confident about what it's reading. The unconscious response to this information deficit is increased scrutiny of whatever signals are available. The channels that remain, your framing in the camera, your lighting, your audio quality, the micro-expressions visible at lower resolution, the pace and tone of your speech, get weighted more heavily than they would in person, precisely because they're doing the work that 40 channels normally share. Understanding this compression problem changes how you think about virtual presence. You're not trying to replicate in-person interaction through a screen. You're trying to deliver enough signal through the 6 available channels to satisfy a perceptual system designed for 40. This requires deliberate amplification of what comes through, not performance or artificiality. Amplification of the genuine signals that would otherwise be lost in compression. Camera positioning at eye level is the single most important technical adjustment available because it determines the fundamental geometry of perceived relationship. A camera aimed upward from a laptop on a desk makes you appear to be looking down at everyone you're speaking to, a subtle dominance cue that creates mild discomfort without anyone being able to name it. A camera aimed downward makes you appear smaller, physically diminished, unconsciously coded as lower status. Eye level creates genuine meeting. This one adjustment, consistently maintained, changes how people experience interactions with you across hundreds of digital encounters. Lighting from in front rather than behind transforms facial readability. The backlit face, window behind the speaker, face in shadow, is one of the most common and most costly video mistakes because the face is the primary remaining channel for emotional and social information. When it's in shadow, the receiver's brain is working harder to read what it can barely see, which produces the vague cognitive fatigue that people attribute to video calls but rarely trace to its source. Well-lit, clearly visible faces reduce that load and make every expression available for the reading that human brains do automatically and constantly. Audio quality matters more than video quality for one specific reason. Voice is the channel through which trust, competence, and emotional state are most efficiently transmitted. Distorted, echoing, or intermittent audio doesn't just make you harder to understand. It creates a fragmented quality that the listener's brain codes as unreliable, a signal processing problem that bleeds unconsciously into credibility perception. A basic external microphone addresses most of this with minimal investment and produces a disproportionate return on perceived professionalism. In digital written communication, email, messaging platforms, formal documents, the usual compression is even more severe. All paralinguistic information disappears. Tone, irony, warmth, urgency, the nuance that voice carries even in brief exchanges, gone. What remains is word choice, structure, and response timing, each of which carries far more weight in the absence of everything else. The most common costly mistake in professional written communication is writing in the register of thought rather than the register of communication. The draft that sounds clear in your head because you have the full context of your own intentions lands ambiguously in the reader who has only the words. What requires active rewriting is not the content, but the assumptions. Asking for each sentence, what would someone read into this who doesn't already know what I mean? Cultural intelligence, which the source material covers in useful detail, rests on a foundation that's worth stating plainly. The framework through which you understand concepts like directness, hierarchy, time, and relationship is not universal. It's a cultural construction so thoroughly internalized that it feels like reality rather than interpretation. The most common failure in cross-cultural communication is not ignorance of the other culture's specific norms. That can be learned relatively quickly. It's the unconscious assumption that your own cultural framework is the neutral baseline from which other cultures deviate. High-context cultures, where meaning is carried as much in what is not said, in relationship history, in shared understanding, as in explicit statement, are not being indirect because they lack the capacity for directness. They're operating a communication system that carries more information per exchange than low-context systems do, for people who share the contextual knowledge to decode it. The low-context communicator who pushes for explicit statement in a high-context environment isn't being helpfully clear. They're demonstrating that they don't share enough context to read the room. And they're being read accordingly. Power distance norms require equally careful handling because the appropriate deference to hierarchy in high power distance cultures is not weakness or sycophancy in the low power distance sense. It's a social technology for managing group coordination efficiently, a different solution to a problem all cultures share. Treating it as a problem to overcome rather than a system to understand produces the particular kind of disrespect that comes from someone who thinks they're being open-minded. The underlying principle in all of it, digital and cultural, is the same. The medium shapes the message in ways that operate below both parties' awareness. Understanding the medium is not optional equipment for the globally operating professional. It is the literacy on which everything else depends. 6 channels. Make them count. Chapter 15. The Practice That Doesn't End. There is a story that gets told about respect, about authority, about presence, about the kind of person who commands genuine attention, that frames it as a destination. You learn the principles, you apply the techniques, you build the reputation, and at some point, you arrive. The work is done. The respect is established. You can relax into what you've built. This story is wrong in a way that matters, and getting it wrong has a specific cost. Carol Dweck's research on mindset documented something that goes deeper than the motivational framing it's usually given. When people understand a quality as fixed, you either have it or you don't, and the goal is to prove you have it. They respond to setbacks and failures by protecting the self-image rather than updating the skill. Every difficulty becomes evidence about who they are rather than information about what they need to practice. This is not just psychologically uncomfortable. It's neurologically inefficient. The brain encodes learning most effectively when failure is interpreted as a signal about technique rather than a verdict about identity. Growth mindset isn't a positive attitude. It's a more accurate model of how skill acquisition actually works. Applied to the domain of this entire book, presence, influence, emotional regulation, the capacity to command genuine respect, this means that the goal was never to become someone who has these qualities. It was to develop a practice through which these qualities emerge consistently, and to maintain that practice long after the initial improvement becomes invisible from the inside. Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow states provides the specific condition this practice requires. Flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging task where skill and difficulty are optimally matched, requires that the challenge level continuously increases to match the skill level that practice is building. When skill outpaces challenge, engagement drops into boredom. When challenge outpaces skill, engagement collapses into anxiety. The narrow corridor between them is where real development happens, which means the practice doesn't plateau into maintenance. It continuously advances into new territory, or it quietly dies. For the domain of interpersonal presence and influence, this means that the situations you work with should be getting harder, not easier, as your capabilities develop. The difficult conversation that once required all your regulatory resources and now feels manageable. That's the cue to find the next conversation that currently sits just beyond your comfortable range. Not to seek unnecessary conflict or manufacture adversity, but to resist the gravitational pull toward situations you've already mastered. Mastery without application to new challenges is not mastery in any living sense. It's a skill in storage. The 30-day blueprint offered in the source material is a useful structure for initiating change, and it's worth honoring it as a beginning rather than a curriculum. The first week's work, breath, presence, physical groundedness, doesn't become unnecessary when you've built the habit. It becomes the foundation that everything more complex rests on. The practices that feel mechanical and deliberate in week 1 should, by month 6, be so deeply integrated that they operate without conscious supervision. That integration is the marker of real change, not the early effortful performance of new behaviors. Self-assessment in ongoing practice requires a specific quality of honesty that is different from both self-criticism and self-congratulation. The question worth asking regularly is not, "Am I better than I was?" which invites the kind of comparative thinking that generates either complacency or despair. But where is the gap between how I intend to show up and how I'm actually landing? The gap is always somewhere. Finding it requires feedback from people who will tell you what's true rather than what's comfortable, and it requires the inner stability to receive that feedback as useful rather than threatening. The integration of everything in this book resolves ultimately into a single orientation, the movement from performance to presence. Performance is what you do when you're managing how you're perceived. Presence is what you bring when you're focused entirely on what's actually happening and what it genuinely requires. The entire arc from Chapter 1 to here has been pointing at this distinction. The 150 millisecond verdict that others make about you is not primarily a read on your techniques. It's a read on whether you're actually there. The paradox at the center of all of this is that the qualities most associated with commanding respect, stillness, groundedness, the capacity to be fully present without needing the room to confirm you, these are not produced by trying to command respect. They're the natural expression of someone who has stopped needing to. The work, all of it, is not the installation of new behaviors. It's the gradual removal of the layers of self-protection, approval-seeking, and performance that were obscuring what was already there. You were not trying to become someone worthy of respect. You were learning to stop performing the absence of it. That practice doesn't end. But at some point, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary conversation, you'll notice that it has become less like practice and more like simply being who you are. That's the arrival. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes true.